people in our society often love and revere and sort of take care of a single animal while forgetting about all the rest. And so you see that really clearly with things like animals who have escaped from slaughterhouses or who have escaped from factory farms, where they'll often get like social media followings and they'll go to sanctuary and people will name them, but then they'll go have a burger for dinner and like don't kind of connect that every animal could go to sanctuary if we all stopped eating them. And those social pressures were really hard and meant that it took me almost another year to sort of own it as an identity, to say, no, I really believe in this actually. And I really believe in it so much that I'm going to make it my career. And I really think that this is the biggest wrong we've perpetrated as a species potentially ever. And I just think like we have to do something different. We can't keep living like this. I really have a lot of compassion for people who are going through any phase of that without that speciesist lens, without the sort of stories that we've told ourselves over and over again, that chickens are for food and pigeons are for city streets and bluebirds are for admiring when they come back in the spring. Like I think those stories are all just stories, and I think they can change.
Good morning, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. And it was also a pleasure to read your new book, Forget the Camel, which I'd literally just finished this morning. It was a fascinating exploration. So I was saying before we started, I almost feel like I have a slightly parasocial relationship. I feel like I know you a little bit, even though it's only the first time we've met. So congratulations on the book. And I think its themes will run through much of the conversation today. And we have a few connections with previous guests as well, because I know you interviewed Mark Beckhoff for the book, and he was one of my very early guests. And I recently read Kim Stallwood's interview of you as well on his Substack. He was an earlier guest as well. And I'm sure there are many more connections in my guest list that we could dig into too. This series of conversations, though, is, I think, focused on the deepest and most important philosophical questions, and ones that are often neglected. And they're questions about, what's real, what's true, and how should we understand this crazy universe we all share? But just as importantly, questions about the foundations of ethics, what matters, but critically, who matters? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which you might set as an alternative to, maybe various religious worldviews or other non-religious worldviews like humanism. And in a sentence, it says, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're answering the what's real, what's true question, it says, look, we don't really know, but let's, with humility, try and work it out by using information from reality to try and understand it as well as we can. So a sort of naturalistic approach. And on the ethical side, it's quite open-minded, but it does say that at least all sentient beings, any being that can feel, that can experience, that has interests, has a perspective, should matter, and should matter seriously in our moral consideration. But I'm very lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling variety of guests, not all of whom agree with that worldview too. But so regardless, it's fascinating to explore your own personal philosophical journey around those questions and how that underpins your work and the new book. But before we get into those, how would you best introduce yourself to those who haven't come across your work already?
Well, I am a writer and a lawyer. I am very passionate about animals and animal advocacy, and I think tend to agree with, the introduction that you provided to your worldview about sentient creatures matter far more than I think we often treat them with. That we often don't treat them with respect as if they matter in the same way that you and I matter. And I think that is a real problem in our world and in our society that I feel really called to do something about, which is part of why I wrote this book. So my new book is called Forget the Camel, and it's about animal festivals around the country, and I sort of study them as microcosms of our relationships to non-human animals more generally. So I try to think about them in categories to try to make sense of how we treat so many different animals differently based on, who they are and what they look like and what we assume about them, while also trying to say something kind of bigger about our interspecies relationship with all animals.
Yeah, thank you. And that's what I found fascinating about the book. One, it's just a sort of mind-blowing exploration of so many different types of animal-centric festivals that I'd never heard of and didn't realize existed. There's obviously the impact of the direct impact on the animals, the sentient beings that are, the focus of these festivals. And there are very many different impacts, most of them bad in a variety of different ways. But as you hinted at there, it's also a fascinating lens into the human psychology, sociology, anthropology, even politics that, drives our relationship with non-human sentient beings more broadly as well. So, it was a very distinctive lens in that sense. So,
Yeah, and I think that it's a lens that grew as I worked on this book. So I think, to your point about the different festivals and how wide ranging they are, I went to a Rattlesnake Roundup in Texas where they beheaded and killed rattlesnakes in public and, made bloody handprints with the blood from the snakes' necks and all, and very kind of very violent in that obvious way. But then I went to, a jumping frog contest that was like quirky and, meant to be a little more of a fun family good time. And then all the way up to like Groundhog Day in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, which was this massive party. Everyone was happy. And I think throughout my research to realize that there's a lot more that tie those events together than separates them in some ways, even though, you're killing animals in one context and not in another context, but that the overarching paradigm of human superiority applies to all of them across the board.
yeah, thank you. And we'll dig into that as we go through the later questions as well. But maybe if we can start with the first of these really deep philosophical questions and sort of dig into your philosophical journey, the question of, what's real and what's true. And this is a tough one, right? Because epistemology, how we come to know stuff or how we come to believe things is so broad because it affects absolutely every belief we have, from the trivial to the profound. But quite often an interesting way into it is to explore with my guest whether they grew up in a society and a family that was maybe more supernatural, spiritually minded, religiously affiliated, or one that was maybe more scientific, more naturalistic in that sense, and how that side of their thinking about the sort of deep questions of the nature of reality and how to best understand it have changed over their life, if they have. So you can wind the clock back as far as you're comfortable to sort of tell that story.
Sure, yeah. So I think my answer is in some ways exactly what situated me to write this book. So I have both backgrounds very strongly, both the sort of religious spiritual side and I would call it the more scientific, naturalistic kind of embodied side. Grandparents, my grandfather was a minister, my grandmother was a veterinarian and an anthropologist, and she features very heavily in this book for reasons I can get into later. And so I had both of those as like core pillars of my upbringing was, science and, kind of thinking about the world really critically, really analytically, reading, writing, all of that kind of stuff on one side. And then equally powerfully on the other side was a real Protestant Christian upbringing in the church. My grandfather was a minister. My mom's a minister. That was very present to how I was raised and how I was brought up to sort of think about the world around me was always with these, I would say, core values, maybe more than like religious dogmatism of compassion, of, kindness, of generosity, of sacrifice, like of sort of like what I would say key Christian values. I know, there's lots of differing opinions about what those values might be, but to me, they were framed in this really sort of open-hearted, open-minded, compassionate lens. And I was really lucky to be raised in a version of the Christian church that prioritizes those things. And
I'm interested in whether both your parents and your grandparents, did they see those two ways of thinking as sort of competing worldviews that you had to choose between, or did they find that there is a reconciliation between the both, or a way you can bring the best of both together, or how do you think they thought about those?
yeah, I think definitely the latter. I think the
Yeah,
reconciliation is like the two sides work so closely together, which is what I was going to say is my dad's like a software engineer, computer science guy. Like he's so analytical and that, so like that, those two pillars, they're not antithetical. It's not, you believe in God or you believe in science. Like that was never how I was raised. And I think in many ways, the sort of mysteries of the world around us were shown to me as things you can explore with a variety of disciplines. You could read the Bible, you could talk to people, you could read a book, you could, do a science experiment. Like there's all sorts of ways to sort of figure out what's going on. And I was given so many models of that as I was growing up. And I mean, this is an anecdote that I write in the book, but I think one example of what I mean by that is when I was really little, I remember so clearly, my grandparents lived on a gentleman's farm. Sort of they had animals and we spent a lot of time outside when we were visiting there. And I remember seeing a bug, like a little beetle, and just like totally losing my mind as a kid. I was afraid, I was screaming. I was like, oh my God, it's a bug. And my grandparents didn't really do anything about it. They just sort of like took the bug away and like let me go on with my day. But the next time we saw them, maybe a week or two later, my grandmother gave me a book about bugs, sort of like a kid's book, but that's sort of with some science background to it to sort of try to understand the worldview of bugs. And she said, if you learn more about them, you won't be so afraid of them. And the idea was like, rather than letting your own worst emotions get the best of you about the world around you, like take a step back, learn what you can, try to see the world from their point of view. Just because they're a bug doesn't mean they're not sort of worth that consideration. If I met a human on the street and I felt weird about them, we're taught as the good members of society to say, maybe they were having a bad day, maybe they were going through this or whatever it is. And so it was that same instinct of let's think about what the bug is like, what they're thinking. They don't want to hurt you. That's not what they're here for. You're allowed to be afraid, but you're not allowed to, take your fear out on them or sort of take your negative, the worst parts of yourself out on this innocent creature. So that's a story that I think it's both scientific and spiritual. Like it's both learn about the science of the bugs, learn that they don't want to hurt you. Here's what their eyes look like when they see out of the world. Like there was real sort of intellectual nuggets there, but then also this sort of spiritual undercurrent of why that matters. Why does it matter how a bug sees? It matters because then you have a little bit more of a lens into this other embodied creature on our planet, and I think there's something really spiritual about that too. So I think the two lenses were both very present in how I grew up.
Yeah, thank you. And have you carried that through yourself to today? Would you still describe yourself as Christian, but at the same time using a scientific worldview?
I think so. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think the worlds really work together for me. And I think that's, it's always a journey to sort of figure out how those things work together. And I think, there's a lot more that can be said about both of those things. But yes, I think the two core pieces of using different methods of knowing, some of which are really intuitive and spiritual and deep, and others of which are really analytical and learned and sort of practical. And I think those things, why not use as many tools as we have at our disposal to try to make sense of this world is sort of how I think about it.
Yes, sounds good. Thank you. So that's interesting because it does imply that you're quite open-minded about the sort of epistemological tools you might use to understand the world. There can be different ways of knowing things, because personally, my sort of naturalistic epistemology, the evidence and reason thing, has led me to be quite confident that only the natural world exists. So I think it's very unlikely that gods or supernatural stuff in general, whatever it is, exists. But for my guests who have a higher credence in supernatural stuff, whether it's religious or not, there's an interesting mix, because some of them will say, well, actually, I share your naturalistic epistemology, Jamie. I believe in these things because of evidence and reason. Now, I might disagree with them about how good that evidence is, and we could have a debate, right? But at least we could have a discussion. Because whereas others will say, well, there are certain parts of my thinking that I do actually deliberately use a different sort of epistemology for, and it could be revelation, personal religious experience, or a reference to authority in a text, or other people, or even God directly, or a fideistic faith-based approach as well. So it sounds like you might be somewhere between those two, where you're not like strictly using evidence and reason in a technical sense for everything. You leave space for other sorts of epistemology more broadly.
Yeah, I think I have two responses to that. One is I think that absolutely, I think thinking more broadly, and one of the reasons that I was so drawn to writing nonfiction in the first place is that my brain works in a very interdisciplinary way. Like I often feel really constricted in one discipline or another, and I think that because I think truth is bigger than any discipline, right? Like when you want to really boil down to it, you need all those disciplines, but any one of them isn't going to give you the full answer. And I think that writing in a nonfiction book felt like a way that I could pull in some spiritual stuff. I can pull in some literary theory. I could pull in some historical and cultural analysis. I could pull in some journalism. You can kind of do a little bit of a lot of things to try to say whatever, I thought the core truth was. I don't know if it is, but that's sort of what I was getting at. And
maybe the picture is richer because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that's really part of just how my brain works and why I turned to writing out of what I had started as a legal career, which I think feels in some way like a lot more of a rigid application of sort of written thinking. Writing nonfiction felt in some ways a little more freeing because of that. But the second thing I would say too is that I am someone who, I think that when I think about why I care about animals or why I care about non-human creatures, there is something really spiritual in my answer. And I think it's a hard thing to get across always. And often it just sort of remains unstated as sort of just like an underlying sort of background thought, but like when you look in an animal's eyes, really kind of take a moment and try to connect with that animal. Like there is something really spiritual there. Like you can see another soul that is there behind those eyes, even if you can't speak to it in English or in any other language. You know that it's there, or I feel as if I do. And so it does feel like there's something there. That's part of why I care about animals is again going back to those core values that I learned of compassion, of generosity, of treating others with kindness, of letting the meek inherit the earth, like all of those things. I think that they're so connected to animals for me. It's like part and parcel of it. And to your point about, I guess, thinking through things with sort of a purely religious view, one of the other things about all religion, so I actually studied religion in college. It was my college major, so
Oh, wow.
I have a little bit of background, not just in Christianity, but sort of in world religions too. And one of the things that fascinates me so much about all of them is the power of stories in them. And the Christian tradition certainly relies on stories and parables a lot. The Bible's like literally just like a long list of stories and parables. And I think the stories that we tell have so much power. Like everything that matters in life is a story we tell, right? Like we eat cows because there's a story we tell about cows and their value and why we, how we relate to them. And those stories might be really literal in the sense of a biblical parable, or they might be sort of more unspoken, but kind of like thrumming underneath everything, like the fact that we eat chickens and not dogs or whatever in our society. And so I think when I think about sort of the core aspects of all of these things that connect, I think the fact of stories being so important is like an underlying commitment, I guess, I have to the way that I think about the world is sort of what stories are we drawn to again and again? What's the truth behind them? How could we recast those stories? Should they be recast? Those types of questions are part of what I really love thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that what you call that spiritual or emotional connection with an individual other being, I think is deeply important. And that is one of the risks with taking a sort of naturalistic approach, because if people assume it's a very narrowly scientific approach where you only count things you can put in a spreadsheet, that's not what I mean by evidence and reason, because I think the evidence of our own emotions and our experiences, our lived experience, are the things we come to know. We can be skeptical of them, but they're evidence too. So I've talked to some fascinating scientists on the podcast who will talk about all the different lines of inference that you can use to infer sentience in other humans and in non-humans, biological evolutionary adaptivity, behavior and communications, information processing architecture, the nature of their nervous systems and brains, right? So you can do all the sort of scientific stuff, but as you say, you can just look into the eyes of a puppy or a sheep or a pig and get that direct connection. And I think it's interesting because I wouldn't use the word spiritual or soul in describing that, but I think I feel exactly the same thing you do when I look into the eyes of Luna, our rescue puppy downstairs. So I want to make sure that is there's still space for that emotional connection in this naturalistic worldview. It's not just some sort of narrow intellectual exercise. Yeah, but
Absolutely.
before we move off the epistemology question, I guess one of the reasons why I think epistemology is important, one, I do think a naturalistic way of understanding the world where you just use information from realities probably gives us the best shot at being right about stuff in general. And if we want to make the world better, it's useful to understand it well. So there's that pragmatic reason why I think it's a good bet. I guess there is another reason, which is that sometimes non-naturalistic worldviews that might be based on authority or revelation or faith can cause needless harm in ways that a naturalistic worldview might not. So as one example, there are people with a religious mindset who would say, I'm completely with you and Elizabeth in a rich compassion for every sentient being, but only beings with souls are sentient and only humans are ensouled. So, I completely share your compassion, but I will, without hesitation, torture a non-human animal because they literally do not have a soul. And you could talk about whether Descartes thought this way or so on. But that, in a way, that's an example of someone who could have really strong, robust ethics where they'd agree with you and me in terms of our moral scope and compassion and taking that seriously. But because I think they're just wrong about the world, right? That even good people can do bad things. So how do you think we can respect those types of maybe more supernatural or religious worldviews as a valid way of thinking about the world, and one that can have, like you say, bring richness and a diversity to the way we think, but still put some guardrails around to make sure that people can't go completely off the rails and cause needless harm based on something they believe that is just wrong?
It's a great question, and I have a lot of answers running through my mind. I think, first of all, I guess I'll just speak about my own sort of thinking about this. So my my wife and I talk about this all the time, and she always reminds me that I have a very sort of strange, I guess, or unusual view of Christianity. So, like, when I use those words, I don't think I mean the same things as what other people who might use those same words mean.
Yeah.
And part of that is just, like I said, my upbringing. I think part of that is just like how I've grown as a human, just sort of the things that I've read, and the faith communities that I've had the opportunity to interact with. I think some of it is just accident. But when I think about, religion, I think words like dogma, or sort of sort of more hardcore, I'll say, like sort of those beliefs, like you said, like that animals aren't sold, and those are interpretations. Like those are things that people decide are true based on their reading of certain texts, and I can't say much about those, because that's not how I've been taught to interact with honestly anything. I think those types of dogmas
Yeah.
can be really hard to interact with. I think they give a lot of people a lot of meaning, which is important. I think when people feel like they have an answer, that is in some ways easier than living with a lot of questions, like and I think probably you live with. And so some of that is just sort of, I think, how faith has evolved over millennia. But I guess the other thing I want to say about this is, it's something I've really wrestled with, both personally and kind of like professionally. I think I've learned a lot about, like, so how I came to animal issues at all. Like I said, I had this great background where I was, had the veterinarian and the minister, and it sounds like so self-evident that I would end up caring about animals, but I didn't. I studied, like I said, religion in college, and I was an omnivore, and I really sort of came to this work through what I would call like unlearning. So I read some books about the food system. I read The Omnivore's Dilemma. I read Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. Like I read some things that made me say, like, is that really how things are happening? Like, if that is, what do I want my role in that to be? But still, was an omnivore. I hadn't made any big changes yet. And then I went to law school, and I was lucky enough to take a class on animal law, and then simultaneously was able to sort of go to some events and talks where professionals working in this field sort of came and explained, what happens behind closed doors of the animal agriculture system. And, I remember being in my animal law class and learning that things that I assumed, because I had believed the sort of stories that you hear by walking down the aisles in the supermarket, or hearing things like, humanely raised, or all natural, like all those things, I believed them in some sense. And I think through in law school, I went through this unlearning process where I was sort of like, wait a second, you can't actually trust anything any of these people are saying. Like, all of this is not the truth. And I'm not saying I have, a monopoly on the truth, but I think it made me realize that you can't always trust the things that you hear, which sounds so obvious. But I guess, so this is all in response to what you said, because I think whenever you trust things sort of on face value without investigating them or interrogating them or thinking through your own relationship to those things, I think risks arise. And I think that happens in religion. I think it happens in science. I think it happens sort of all across the board. But, in that process of learning more about animal agriculture and learning more about just animals in our society in general, I really had to sort of think hard about questions like halal and kosher slaughter, where, animals aren't stunned before they're killed, and that there's a religious reason for that, but that it tangibly does more harm to these animals who I believe are ensouled. Like, I believe they have at least a claim on not being tortured. Like, at the very least, they have some claim to bodily autonomy and comfort. And, and I really had to wrestle with that. And so I think that the religious sort of, dogmatism can become so harmful. I absolutely agree with that. But I also think that, looking only at science and ignoring the sort of more emotional, embodied methods of knowing, you're also missing something. So, a long answer to a very good question.
Thank you. And it was interesting in the book that when I think globally and I think of animal festivals, I do quite often think of religion as a motivator in terms of animal sacrifices and so on. But interestingly, there wasn't that much religion in the festivals in the US. There was, sometimes superstition or some mysticism, often with tongue in cheek as well. But it didn't seem to be a major theme. It seemed to be more about community and bringing people together and a celebration and so on. So it was interesting to see that theme play through. But you do mention, some other more religiously motivated festivals in the appendix at the back of the book, where there's a sort of more global lens too. So I thought that was interesting. And you demonstrated, I think, a really healthy blurring of these big questions, right? Because you've already started to go into your answer to who matters and why. And a way into that question is also to think about what matters, right? If we put the question of who matters aside for one moment, how much did your, I guess, Christian worldview underpin what you thought matters as ethical foundations? What do good and bad and right and wrong mean? Because even in a Christian context, for some people, that mean good and bad means doing what God wants, right? So it is more of a divine command theory thing, right? The reason it's good is because God says it's good, so I must do that, which can feel a little bit more like obedience or compliance than doing something because we feel it's good. But many other Christians, as you've hinted at already, almost, how do I put this? Right, I should turn this into a question. Almost independent of God's command, however they're interpreted, feel it's rich imperative for compassion running through them as well. But there's loads of other choices. It can be concern for suffering, it can be justice, it can be fairness, it can be virtue, it can be, there's loads of different ways to think about right and wrong. Again, from a kid, how was that shaped in the sort of Christian context you grew up in? And how do you think about the ethical foundations now? What really is at the root? If you keep asking why is that good or bad, what's at the bottom for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a kid, that was a question that I had a lot. Like, I think that was part of my sort of development as a human, was thinking through that question of how do you know? Because I was never, the church I was raised in was not so rigid. It was not, here's God says do X, therefore you must do X.
Yeah.
Or God says don't do this, or you'll go to hell. Like, I was never given that messaging, which I'm grateful for. I think that's part of why I can still call myself a Christian, is that I had a lot more I had a softness in how I was raised with it, which allowed it to grow with me versus constrict me. But, the it's one of the reasons I studied religion in college, was to try to think about that exact question of where does this information come from, of what matters? Like, how do you decide that? And I think I'm always grateful that I studied so much about Christianity sort of through the millennia, because it forced me to zoom out and to say that, Christianity has not looked, there's no one Christianity, right? Like, there's no, this is my church, this is the truth. Like, that was never something that resonated with me. I think, to the contrary, I've always been interested in the ancient world. And so I was really fascinated with early Christians as they sort of battled for, I mean, like, spiritually battled for meaning. Like, who was going to decide that? Which books were going to go in the Bible? Like, people, I think, are surprised to find out that was a choice, right? Like, that was not always, even looking as a Christian, that was a choice. Like, it was a political and sort of movement building choice. And I'm not, I think we can discuss later whether that's right or wrong, but
which stories are out, which stories are in. Yeah.
Exactly. And then same thing kind of through the millennia, you see early, or, relatively early Christian thinkers talk about exactly the question you just raised. Like, what is the balance between free will and predeterminism? Like, is everything predetermined? Are you just sort of put on this planet to do what God already has preordained for you? Or are you the driver of your fate, and, your choices will add up to something at the end of your life? Or, there's bazillions of other theories kind of in between and on either side of that. So part of my, I think, journey with religion has been this, like, zooming out function of sort of saying, and then you map on top of everything I just said about Christianity and the many, many different manifestations of it that have existed over millennia, but also currently in our own country, in our own time, my country, the United States. And then you zoom even further out and you have these world religions. And I was really lucky in being able to learn about other religions, because I think it makes you, it sort of forces you to answer to yourself about, like, why, if they think this is how, the story of the world came to be, and this is the book that matters, and this is the prophet that matters, like, what makes mine different? And I think the answer that I have is not a lot. Like, I think I'm comforted by the stories I was raised with. I found, I found good lessons in them. I think that they they taught me good values, but it's not, I don't think that I have sort of the sole claim on truth. I wouldn't say that. So I think I feel my religion really differently than some other people. I think some other people feel it as a claim on truth, and they feel like, anyone who is not in their tradition will, suffer the consequences or not be entitled to some divine benefit or something like that. And that is just never how I was raised, and never what has resonated with me. I think what feels powerful about religion to me is the stories that I think connect humans to other humans across time and across sort of like spiritual space. So thinking about why we matter on this planet, like I think there's something deeply comforting in thinking we don't know why, but we know we matter. And I think that religion gives you a little something to kind of hang your hat on there.
Yeah, thank you. And would you say the ethical core of what you find in Christianity, and you can see it echoed through many other worldviews, religious and not, is the idea of compassion for others? Is that at the root, do you think, for you, or is it something else?
I think it is for me.
Yeah.
I do think compassion is a really big one. I think that, and that is something that, I've thought about a lot. I think that, there's lots of lessons in the Bible, but I do think compassion is a core one. And I guess I'll also, say that I am someone who's always interested and willing and sort of eager to read a text like the Bible as a critical thinker, not so much as someone looking for a rule book. And again, I understand religion often does offer it to you more like a rule book, but for me personally, I have read a lot and sort of thought a lot about what those core stories mean in the Bible for animals. So like, what does, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus mean for animals? And I think there is a way to sort of talk about that theology, to sort of recast that theology as saving all embodied creatures. I think, the word in the Bible, I studied Latin and Greek, so I'm really big in the ancient world. And like, Jesus is the word made flesh. He's not the word made human. Flesh is a word that can refer to human and animal flesh. Like that word is not, we do not have a monopoly on what that means. And I'm really compelled by that. Like, as I sort of think about how these stories, if you do want to say these words are divinely inspired, like I don't think that means they exclude animals. I think it means we assume it does, but that's a really different thing, And so I'm really, I think, excited and open to the idea of pushing the boundaries of the stories that we've always assumed are true, and letting our sort of curiosity and our sense of moral justice carry us. And I think that when I think about the Christian tradition in particular, because they had the most experience with it, compassion is certainly, I think, one of the most overarching values. And I think there's others. I think generosity, I think like putting others first, loving your neighbor as yourself. Like, I mean, the list sort of goes on. And I think I don't see any of those values as excluding non-human animals. I see them sort of actually as demanding that we kind of radically include them and think about what is our role here on this planet. I think and I think, yeah, I could go on and on, but I'll leave it there.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And it links beautifully into that, who matters question, because I think many people around the world would sort of agree with you and me that, something about compassion or caring about others in some way is a really deep ethical foundation. But people then have radically different views of, okay, who gets that compassion? So even within our species, we have so many problems with that today, right? There are many, many people who will say, well, only my in-group get the compassion and the out-group humans don't matter or can be discriminated against in some way. But then there is, this stance of thinking, at least in theory, about all humans, universal human rights, anthropocentrism, in the sense that hopefully all humans should matter. And then going beyond that to sentiocentrism, which is roughly where I am, caring about all sentient beings, or even beyond that to biocentrism and ecocentrism, where you start thinking about, do even beings that aren't sentient, or in your terminology, don't have souls but are living, do they matter intrinsically, or do even ecosystems themselves, rocks, rivers, and trees matter? And the religious story is really interesting, because I think many people in the animal advocacy movement who have a non-religious worldview, like me, quite often are quite simplistic about their view of religion, because they will look at religion and often they simplify radically, because the diversity between religions and within religious worldviews is absolutely mind-blowing. You can find so many different perspectives, but they will look at them and say, look, there's something inherent in religious ways of thinking that imposes a hierarchy, because you might have God, you might have angels, you might have priests, you might have believers, you might have non-believers, and then you might have dominion over others. So they'll quite often have a sort of simplistic view that maybe religion here is part of the problem. But through these series of conversations, I think there's a much richer picture available there. But even within the scope of religions, you'll look at certain ways of thinking, like the Dharmic religions, and think, well, they actually are quite far ahead of the game when thinking beyond the human, because you have the idea of ahimsa, non-violence and doing no harm. And that doesn't mean do no harm to humans. That means do no harm at all. And sadly, many adherents to the Dharmic religions don't take that seriously enough these days. But, it is there as an explicit sort of moral stance that goes way beyond the human. Whereas there is this sense about the Abrahamic religions that maybe they are a little bit more hierarchical. It is a bit more about humans are made in the image of God. Maybe only humans have souls, and there's a motivation for human exceptionalism and supremacy there as well. And I should come back to a question, but some of the one of the fascinating conversations I had recently was with Matthew Haltman, who's written a wonderful book called Hungry Beautiful Animals, and he comes from a Christian perspective as well, and he will tell these same stories that you're hinting at, talking about the nature of the Garden of Eden and the story of the Mount of Isaiah and the lamb living with the lion. And just recently I had an interesting workshop in a school, and I asked that question, do you think there would be slaughterhouses in heaven, right? So I think even within the Abrahamic religions, you're absolutely right. There are really rich ways of exploring this idea that we should, it's not just humans we should be caring about too. So I should come back to a question. I call these conversations because it gives me a chance to ramble on as well. But you talked already about your journey to broadening your moral scope and thinking seriously about animals and how that happened at law school. What degree as a child did you have experiences with non-human animals, and what was the influence of your sort of Christian thinking on that as a kid? Was that something you had to re-engineer the human exceptionalism out of, or did you even at a young age see the compassion extending beyond the human?
I think the latter. I definitely, was taught that animals are deserving of our care and compassion and sort of general respect. And I think that how I would describe it now, looking back, is I think I just had a relatively speciesist approach to that. So, our pets deserved basically, as much love and care as we could give them, and as much sort of kindness. And, you obviously never wanted to do anything that would hurt them. And to the contrary, you wanted to take them to the vet when they were sick and really kind of, care for them. And I think same thing with wildlife. My parents, we grew up always with like bird feeders in the backyard, and we'd build into our sort of family, life cycle of a calendar year. We lived in New England, and so we had really strong seasons, and every seasonal kind of change of the wildlife was really important to my family. Like when migrating birds come back, we sort of marked that, we talked about it. Or when we saw deer come through the yard, we thought like, wow, what a great visitation. Like we always were grateful for the world of wildlife, and were always sort of, I think, brought up to respect wildlife and to sort of not only do no harm, but sort of to think poorly about anyone who did do harm, right? Like leaving snare traps or hunting. Like we were always, that was sort of never on the table for us.
And it sounds like that wasn't just a sort of reverence for the aesthetics of nature. It was also, there was also compassion for the individuals within the nature too. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think especially so for pets, right? I mean, I think our pets were members of the family. And so I think, again, now knowing, kind of having gone further on this animal journey, I think the word for that is speciesism, because we still ate meat, we still ate eggs, we still drank milk. Like we sort of did a lot of other things that, use animals, harm animals, however indirectly, but certainly participate in that. And I think we just sort of lived in that dissonance. And I think a lot of families do. I think a lot of, like, I am not the only family in America who loves their pets and, eats cows. I think that was very much very normal. And I think it still is. And, I don't have any sort of bad feelings about that. I think I was raised in a wonderful way, and I had all the tools given to me to sort of start on this journey to think about the rest of the animals, think about the animals that sort of suffer the most in our society, which I do think are animals who are farmed for food. And And that, I think that when you are given the right foundation, you can sort of take it to a good place. So I think I was given a good foundation. And I think, I want to respond to your sort of thoughts on hierarchy, which I think are relevant here. I think they're really relevant to the concept of speciesism too, because it sort of presumes this hierarchy, right? That like, pets are up here closest to humans, and then they sort of work your way down. And I think the hierarchy piece is something that as an adult, like now I wrestle with and think about a lot. And I do in the book that I just wrote too. The last chapter is about the trial of a school teacher in Tennessee in 1925 when he taught evolution in a classroom, and the state had made it illegal to teach evolution because it sort of threatened human primacy. It threatened this idea that humans were ensouled, were the image of God, like all the things you said. And I think that, casting humans as just another animal is really threatening to some people, but I like personally don't see it as threatening. I see it as kind of like miraculous. Like we have so many other creatures on this planet that are embodied too. And I think the dominion, I'm not the only person who's thought this, but dominion doesn't have to mean, domination. Dominion can mean stewardship. Like there's lots of other ways to kind of push those boundaries. And I think what a gift that we've been given language and rationality and reason. And like, I just really think we should all start looking around and using it, and my definition of that would be to care for animals without that speciesist lens, without the sort of stories that we've told ourselves over and over again that chickens are for food and, pigeons are for city streets and, bluebirds are for admiring when they come back in the spring. Like I think those stories are all just stories, and I think they can change.
Yeah, thank you. And you talked about that process of almost unlearning as you went through it, because we all grow up in a society where so much of the speciesist and oppressive ways of thinking and behaving are just assumed to be normal. How did you find that process yourself, both the unlearning, but also the practical implications of, vegetarianism, veganism, and the things you've gone on to do? Was it psychologically difficult? Did you find it socially difficult? Because some of my guests, they're sort of wonderfully weird people where it's just like a light going on and they change and they don't give a shit what anyone else thinks, right? And it's just done, right? And they're quite rare. For others, including me, it's quite a long journey of sort of struggling to work through these things yourself, and then also coming to terms with how awful default humanity is. Right? How did you feel about that transition? And it may well be a transition that never really ends. But
oh man, it was hard. It was hard and slow. It's like now looking back, it was so much harder and slower than it needed to be. But I'm grateful in some ways that I experienced that as an adult, because I'll always remember sort of how hard and slow it was for me. And I think that it gives me a lot of empathy and sympathy for people who are sort of at the very beginning of starting to reevaluate their relationship with animals. So yeah, I like I said, was an omnivore until I went to law school, which was in 2018. That whole first year of law school, I was like slowly giving up meat, but sort of one thing at a time. So like I don't even really like pork or pig products. So that was easy. I just like stopped. Like I never really was eating them. So I just sort of told myself now I will no longer eat them. And that was like the babyest step I could take, because it didn't ask actually any change of me almost at all. And then next was red meat, sort of same thing. It's like I only had it once in a while anyway. So super easy to say I was giving up, even though it, again, didn't actually sort of force me to confront my day-to-day habits or anything. I think chicken came next, and then fish was like almost a full year later. Like it took some time. And I didn't sort of take the jump to veganism despite knowing everything that I know. Like it was not a matter of knowledge, right? Like I understood about the dairy industry. I understood about the egg industry. Like I'd studied it. I'd read, reports from whistleblowers. Like I knew all the bad things, and that dissonance was still so strong that it took me time. And it wasn't until COVID hit and I could only go to the grocery store once every 2 weeks, and I had to cook all 3 meals a day at home. And I just sort of decided, like, I just didn't buy eggs and dairy. I was just like, well, like I don't actually like them that much at that point. And I think it's a default. It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction almost, like oh, I'm walking down the egg aisle, let's grab some. But I would often throw a few away at the end of the week. Like it wasn't something I needed. It just sort of was a habit. And so I decided, kind of casually, honestly, just like I wouldn't buy them. And then because I couldn't go back to the grocery store, that was that. Like I had to cook with what I had in my
You're
fridge.
committed.
Yeah. And that was great. And I think because of that too, COVID also not only forced me to cook, but because I couldn't, break up the week with a delicious takeout meal. Like I had to learn how to make my food taste good, which I think that sounds so obvious, but I think it's a step a lot of people miss when they try to go vegan is like meat has so much flavor in it. And I think it's really, then you can just like make some rice and steam some broccoli and you have a meal that tastes good. But when you do the same thing with tofu or beans, like it doesn't taste that good. It tastes really kind of boring. And so in COVID, because there was no other option, I like learned how to make food taste good to me. And I think that is just because I was forced to, I'm always grateful for that because I think once your food tastes good, then it's like, you don't miss stuff quite so much anymore. So anyway, it was a huge journey for me, I think time wise. So that whole process was 2 years. I went to law school in 2018 and I wouldn't say I went vegan. Like what I count as my vegan anniversary is actually like right now, like March 2020 was when I went vegan, which is 5 years ago now, which is crazy. And I think that even after that, so even after I made the change, I stopped eating animal products. I started thinking about other things too, like products that were tested on animals or used animal products or like wool or leather, things like that. I started thinking about more and more too, and choosing other options when I could, which was always, but sometimes it takes a little more work. Even after all that, I still found it really socially hard. For about maybe 6 months or a year after I went vegan, I would call myself a lazy vegan. And when I was out, if a friend had made something or if, I was at a coffee shop and everyone was getting something and I wanted to be a part of it, that I would sort of make that sort of, I don't know, make that, sacrifice almost of my values to fit in with the people around me and to make people feel less uncomfortable. Because I do think at the end of the day, when you say you're vegan, people do get a little uncomfortable and they say they don't, but I think you can often see it on their faces or hear it in how they start kind of justifying their own choices. And in a way that, I don't ask, but if I didn't order something and I said, there's actually nothing on this menu for me, I'm vegan, often what happens is people respond with something like, oh, I wish I could be vegan, but, here's my 5 reasons. And it always made me feel bad. Like I'm like, I love you as a person. That's why we're here getting this meal. I don't, I don't mean to make you feel that way. So those social pressures were really hard and meant that it took me almost another year to sort of own it as an identity, to say, no, I really believe in this actually. And I really believe in it so much that I'm going to make it my career. And I really think that this is the biggest wrong we've perpetrated as a species potentially ever. And I just think like we have to do something different. We can't keep living like this. It feels really urgent to me now. And so but that journey again, that took time. It was not instant. And I think I really have a lot of compassion for people who are going through any phase of that, because I think it does take time. And despite, I think, our best efforts, it also means facing the fact that you weren't that way before. Like it means I had to sit there when I was, in law school and say, I've eaten meat for whatever, 28 years. Like that, you have to really reckon with that. How many animals I have killed for me, for so that I could be here. And it wasn't necessary, as I know now. And it wasn't kind or humane, as I know now. Like I was a part of this machine of horror. And you have to really reckon with that once you step out of it and let the, wool fall from your eyes. And you're like, wait a second, what have we been doing? And I think that's a really hard process. It's hard to own up to that and to sort of decide that it's worth a change. And I'll say one more thing, because I know I'm going on about this, but I feel really strongly about it, is I also think it's really a myth, I think, that there's no sacrifice for this. Like being vegan is hard. And I think sometimes it's easy. At home, it's easy. But like when you travel, like I travel a lot for work or for other things. And I mean, I'm often hungry. Like I'm often hungry for days when I travel because there's not, enough vegan options, or the options that are there aren't that healthy, so they don't keep you full long. I think like there are things that I love that I don't get to eat anymore. And that is, some of them are sort of culturally important, like sort of in my family. Some of them are just like treats I love. Like I love going to a coffee shop and getting a scone, and like they're often not vegan. So like I often now go to a coffee shop and get my oat milk latte, and that's it. And that does feel like a loss. Like I do feel that. And I think one of the things that I try to tell people a lot is like, for me, it's just the cost to animals was so high for such a momentary pleasure that sacrifice feels so worth it. Like it's not, I think we do a disservice sometimes when we say like being vegan is so easy, anyone can do it, because the truth is it's actually a little hard. Like you do have to make choices over and over again that go against the grain of society, that ask you to give up something that you probably loved, and that, ask you to build different habits than you've had for your whole life. And those things are really hard. Like I think they take time and they take effort and they take commitment. And, I think that the perfect can be the enemy of the good with that stuff. And I often just tell people, anywhere you can cut it is a place to start. Like if like for me, like I started with pork because I never ate pork. Like it barely even counted as a decision. Yet it made me feel like I was doing something that I sort of was concrete in alignment with my values. So yeah, I think veganism is a whole there's a whole bucket of worms there we could
Yeah,
talk about forever.
absolutely. No, thank you. That was fascinating. And as social beings, like you say, our instinctive response to encountering that social friction is to almost apologize for ourselves or to try and soften things, and sometimes almost to even patronize the people we're engaging with instead of being clear about the ethical issue. So there's that social challenge. Then there is that additional challenge, that transition, if you like, of doubling down on the seriousness of the ethics and considering the victims seriously enough that you lock in as you then did, right? That is almost like an extra step. And like you say, I think recognizing that because of the social environment we're in the practical environment, there are real sacrifices to be made. And I don't know if that's another echo of some of your sort of background Christian worldview, but making a sacrifice for a good reason, for a good cause, can in itself become a joy, right? It can actually become a good thing. So that's fascinating. And the other thing I think is useful that you mentioned early on in that description was that it helps you empathize with others who are going through this journey, because you can remember yourself going through it too, and I can as well. My journey was even longer than that, and again, it's never really completely finished. But I think that is a really useful lens, is to remember who I was. Right, I wasn't a bad person back then. You weren't a bad person back then, and yet we did things that we now think are ethical abominations. Right, we participated in those systems needlessly. Right, so that's an interesting transition. But to come back to the book, because I think I've taken you through your whole philosophical story now. One of the great things about the book is that you're almost helping us with that lens of psychologizing the philosophy of humanity more broadly as well. So as you went to the different festivals, you and your wife went to the festivals, I'm interested in what they felt like for you as someone who's gone through this journey and takes non-human animals seriously. And I'm also interested in how you structure your view of, what's the big picture that it told you about how, the average human thinks about these topics. And you frame the book in the structure of thinking about, dominance, humor, and reverence as a structure. But again, I'm asking too many questions at once, right? But how did it feel to you for you going to these things? And then how do you think the people there felt, and what has that taught you about human thinking and social norms?
These festivals, I had so many complicated emotions about them, both before I went and when I went. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book was that my grandmother, this veterinarian anthropologist, she, before she died, was just starting to conceive of a book that would have been kind of like an academic anthology of animal festivals around the world. And so she was, I think really looking at it as an anthropologist, of studying the people there, studying, the stories they were telling, all of that. And she died before she could finish the book. And so that, like, all of her work kind of sat there unfinished. And during COVID, I pulled out some of her old notes and just sort of started to do some research and look around and basically say, like, wow, these things are still happening. Like it's almost like, you hear about some of them and you're like, wow, that sounds so, like something that would have happened a long time ago, or something that a different society would do, or something like that. And I was so surprised to see that these were all not only still happening, but many of them had grown, many of them had sort of evolved into be even more kind of like digging down into these stories about animals. So
Yeah, they do feel like tales from the past, quite a few of them.
in some ways, yeah. So I think like this, I give that background to start my answer to your question about how it felt to go, because I think I was doing two things at these festivals. One was like trying to observe them and see what was going on, and the other was really thinking about my relationship with my grandparents, my relationship with like my own sort of like philosophical journey with all this stuff. I think was very much happening while I was visiting these places. And yeah, I think that the book is structured, like you said, in three parts to sort of mimic or I guess like mirror what I would say are three major categories of how we relate to animals, kind of just like spiritually, philosophically, socially. So the first is dominance, which I think are the most obvious examples of exploiting animals, sort of killing them, using them for our purposes, that sort of thing. The second section is humor, which I think is in some ways the most interesting section, where I think these animals are just like kind of treated as props, like almost like a non-entity. We're very ambivalent about them. And then the final section of the book is called reverence, where I think some animals in our society get treated with a lot of respect and love and sort of protection and sort of all of the above. So the festivals that I visited tended to fall into one of these three categories, which was helpful for writing the book, but also helpful, I think, for kind of like thinking about these festivals as categories, right? As like archetypes almost. Any one of these festivals, some of them are, big-ish. They have 40 to 60,000 people attend, but none of them are like, massive. I mean, these aren't, millions of people going to these events. And so I think they gain meaning when you start adding them up. I think when you start zooming out and saying, oh, wow, we actually like many, many communities around the country do this, around the world. I mean, I focus on the United States because that's my background and it's my, I have a window into the legal world since I went to law school here. And it felt really, I think, natural in some ways to talk about my own context, but they happen all over the country, all over the world. I mean, excuse me. And my grandmother, when she was working on this book, got really passionate about the wren hunting festival on St. Stephen's Day in the United Kingdom and ended up writing a whole book about that. So like any one of these festivals, you could write a whole book about. But one of the things that was important for me was to sort of look at them as a category and to sort of start to see how they played together. So, how it felt to go to these festivals, I think varied based on a category is sort of why I gave all that background. I think the Rattlesnake Roundup, where they kill these snakes in public, was really hard. It was really hard to watch so much death and pay for it. I mean, I had to pay an entrance fee if I wanted to see it. And so, I gave them my $10 or whatever and went in. And then like that was a real sort of moral question I had to answer to myself of like, is the good I can do from writing the story worth the $10 admission fee? And I decided it was, but that's not a perfect decision. I think there's lots of other ways to go about that. And same thing, like I think I did a raw dog sled race in Alaska. I went to the start of it in Anchorage or just north of Anchorage. And, that it was fun. It's like such a cool sort of part of Alaskan history and Alaska's so beautiful. And like there was really good things about it. But at the end of the day, like I watched those dogs start on this journey and I knew what was ahead of them. I don't know if they did, but I did. And it just sort of felt so sad. Just like so sad that many of them were going to really, really suffer. And the year I went, no dogs died, but the last 2 years, dogs have died on the Iditarod, both years. And I think that, it just sort of started raising these questions of, is any of this worth it? Like you hear explanations all the time of why people do these things, but the reasons don't, to me, feel like they hold up to the depth of the harm that's happening. And then I think one of the reasons that I structured the book the way I did, with from dominance to humor to reverence, is to try to take the reader on a journey. Like, what might this look like to move up this, scale, if you will, of exploitation? So you start with the killing and you sort of work your way up to something that looks more positive, right? Something that looks like mutual respect or care or consideration or something like that. And I think one of the hard parts of writing that book and of researching it was that a lot of the festivals, even if they were sort of presented as funny things or as honorific things, they still had domination at their core. I think like when you're making fun of an animal or using animal as a prop to make something funny, but then, you're sort of discarding them back into the wild, or you're treating them like an animal in captivity with not a lot of forethought. Like that's not great either. So it felt really, I think, both for me going and then to write the book, I was trying to say something, in addition to, I think, the fact that we use animals, like what I learned about how, like what unites all of these festivals across all of these categories is that we're using these animals sort of against their will in most cases to say something about ourselves, like to tell our own human stories. We're saying, 100 years ago, this happened, or 50 years ago, this happened. And so now we have to do it every single year. And the reason that human instinct is we all have it. That's why we do the same thing for, the holidays every year. We have family traditions, like tradition and history and sort of like rituals are so important to us as a species. But these particular ones, have victims. And I think that that's part of what I tried to get across in the book is that it's not the fact that we want to tell our stories again. It's the fact that we're using animals to do that to their detriment, to their harm, sometimes to their death. And, I think that using animals as a storytelling technique is ultimately disregarding them as creatures. It's treating them like disposable props. So that's kind of the arc of the book and the takeaway, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And the justifications you talked about there, and we might put justifications in inverted commas if we don't feel they're strong enough to really be justifications. A really interesting lens into human psychology and sociology, because as you said, it's about tradition, it's about culture, it's about reverence for the past or respect for the past, but it's also about community and bringing people together in the present day. And it can be about entertainment, and it can be, and there can be other motivations in there as well that you touch on in some of the examples. It can be pest control, or managing invasive species populations, or there can be other motivations that get plugged in. But it does feel like that tradition and culture thing is probably the core rationale that's driving most of these. And I really like the sort of dominance, humor, reverence structure as well, because some examples really fit in cleanly, right? So as you say, the Rattlesnake Roundup is like a canonical, pure example of the dominance setup, where the violence is part of the point, right? The gore and the violence and the destruction and the killing is unashamed and absolutely central, and actually celebrated, right? And glorified in a sense. And maybe so the camel and the ostrich races you talk about are canonical examples of the humor setup, where it really is just sort of pure entertainment. The non-human animals are just objects of entertainment. But even in the humor space and in the reverence space with Groundhog Day, as you say, even in those slightly less egregiously harmful situations, there's still an undercurrent of assumed dominance and exploitation and human supremacy that runs through even the most beneficial of those as well. So it's a really interesting way of structuring that. And I'm interested in drilling in a little bit on the reverence example, because in a way you set that out as the least egregious and the most the charitable approach we can take. And I don't know if you want to pick out an example to sort of illustrate what you mean by that reverence
Sure.
example, and also where its limitations are.
Yeah. Well, I guess first I'll say that I think the three categories that I selected are starting points, and I view this book very much as a book on the chapters. Each festival is on a spectrum. So I think you're right. Like the Rattlesnake Roundup's chapter in the dominant section is the most obvious, but the second chapter in that section is about the Maine Lobster Festival, and that is a little less obvious. It feels like this is just they are killing animals, but it's for food. It's like it has a really different vibe, and they're doing it in such a different manner. And so, I had to really wrestle with where do I put that in this book? And I realized sort of that it's actually the exact same as the Rattlesnake Roundup. Like they're taking these animals out from the wild. They're still alive when they come in. They're killing them in public. They're dismantling their bodies in public. They're eating the flesh. They're selling souvenirs with the claws and the skins. They're really actually very similar events. It's just the tenor of it is different. And that is so hard to put your finger on. But so I realized that I think these things they're on a spectrum. And like you said, I think reverence is another good example of that, where Groundhog Day was the first chapter in reverence. So I went to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania for their big Groundhog Day sort of party and celebration. And it was honestly really fun and funny. And it was this humorous, really good natured event. And that could have been in the humor section. Everything about it was tongue in cheek. Everything about it was, purposefully not serious. And I think it was meant to be kind of like a distraction from midwinter blues, right? That's always been the case with Groundhog Day. It's looking towards spring. And, I use it as the start of the reverence section because it's, I think, a very good example of how people in our society often love and revere and sort of take care of a single animal while forgetting about all the rest. And so you see that really clearly with things like animals who have escaped from slaughterhouses or who have escaped from factory farms, where they'll often get social media followings, and they'll go to sanctuary and people will name them, but then they'll go have a burger for dinner and don't kind of connect that every animal could go to sanctuary if we all stopped eating them. And I think that, or if they do connect it, they don't care, right? Because there's the one that mattered. They broke out somehow. They changed the paradigm. We care about that one. And caring about that one doesn't actually ask anything of us. It just says, we can like something on social media and then go back to our lives. And I think Groundhog Day is an example of that, where Punxsutawney Phil gets an unbelievable amount of attention and celebrity, and people love him. People were shirts with his face on it. I saw someone with like leggings with groundhogs printed on it. Like people love Phil. But when I was driving to Punxsutawney for the morning of Groundhog Day, my wife and I saw 2 dead groundhogs on the road. Like in addition to other dead, roadkill, like we saw a deer and a possum and other things. But like that sort of was just such a stark reminder of like, we say we care about Phil, we say we love him, but we don't actually care about anyone else who looks like him. We don't care about managing wildlife in a way that reduces conflict. We don't care about treating Phil with sort of species specific respect, in terms of letting him hibernate, letting him live his own life on his own terms. There's lots of ways you could drill into that as actually not really being that positive for Phil. And so, if reverence looks like kind of exploitation of the individual, that's a trickier place to be. And I think, again, starts looking a lot more like that dominance, starts looking a lot more like we're using animals however we want, just because we want to. And like that is enough. The last chapter of the book, the last substantive chapter is about a festival in California that welcomes the return of migrating monarch butterflies. And this festival was very quaint. It was very sweet. It's like, very small town energy. The kindergartners in town dress up like monarchs every year. They make their own costumes and they dress up like monarchs. And then they walk down, they parade down the center of their town. And it's it was an unbelievably sort of pleasant festival, especially compared to some of the other ones that I went to. And it's also not the only one like it. Monarch butterfly festivals happen kind of all over the country. Monarchs are such a uniting species. People really love them. And in that chapter, I think I try to offer, a different model maybe where people are, we're still talking about animals. We're still using the symbolism. We're still like relating ourselves to them in some core way. But, we aren't taking them out of the wild. We aren't killing them. We aren't forcing them to do something for our sake just because we want to. And, I explain in that chapter how the monarch butterfly festival hasn't always been so good. Like in their early history, they did take monarchs and they tried to release them as part of this parade and ended up killing a lot. And it became so unsightly that they stopped. Like it became, they didn't want to be killing these birds. This was, over 80 years ago. So a long time ago. And then, the town has sort of continuously evolved its relationship with monarchs to try to focus even more on conservation, on preservation, on, how we can sort of preserve this species that is really suffering and in many ways, dying out thanks to things like climate change and animal agriculture and all sorts of other things. And so I think it's a opportunity, it's a possibility. I think it's offered as sort of a coda on what otherwise might be a really hard story to read. And I don't think it's realistic to say, let's stop doing animal festivals. Let's stop using animals as symbolic reference. Because the truth is that's not how our brains work. Like we all look around the world and we see animals, and every single one of us, all of us, to some degree, use animals as part of our worldview. Whether it's because we eat them, whether it's because we have them as pets, whether it's because we wear their skin on our feet, like everyone uses animals. Or people like you and me who might be vegan and not do those things, like we're thinking about it we're still thinking about it, right? Like it's still part of our life and our worldview. And so I think it's really, like I said, I think it's short-sighted or not realistic to say, let's just stop. I think we have to think, how can we do this? How can we like listen to our instincts of using animals as a way to make sense of our world without harming the animals? And I just think like we are smart enough as a species to do that.
Yeah. And I think that was a really powerful way to close out the book, and it sort of prefigures this, how do we make a better world concluding question we'll come on to in a moment. But I also like the way that you drew us through to the reverence stage, but then make it clear that that's not the end point, right? Even that has its own issues, right? Because the act of reverence still ultimately is about us humans. It's not about respecting the non-human sentient beings for who they are and what they want to be. And I had another interesting parallel conversation a while back with the academic Yamini Narayanan, who wrote a wonderful book called Mother Cow, Mother India. And it's framed with this question about, if in many varieties of Hinduism, the cow is seen as sacred, how come India is one of the world's largest beef and milk producers, right, as a country? And it's well worth digging into that interview and that book. Her work is absolutely fascinating. But one of the concluding themes is being worshipped isn't good for you, right? It is really just another form of exploitation and objectification. And you can see that when it's done to other humans, right? There are certain cultures or certain ways of thinking that will, worship an individual that they've picked as their, their new religious leader. And often that isn't good for the human. In the same way, being worshipped as a cow often isn't really good for the cows, because it's not really about what they want. It's about them as some sort of object in the human mind, in the same way Punxsutawney Phil is, revered, but only really as a human symbol, not for who Phil, in his various incarnations actually is. So I think that was really interesting how you sort of draw us towards it, but then you're clear that that isn't the end point. So this final question, how do we make a better world? You've already started to hint at it, because I think one response to these types of festivals is to look at the justifications that people frame and that you explain, the culture, the tradition, the bringing communities together, and just say, look, they are not good justifications, so shut the whole thing down. And I think you take a more sympathetic approach to that, whereas you've explained with the Monarch Butterfly Festival, are there ways of keeping the good and keeping the bad? And I think that's a great prefiguring. Now, how broadly do you think that can work as you look through all the different festivals that you examined? Can you imagine, if you like, a sort of just transition path for each of those that genuinely strips out the exploitation and the objectification and the harm, but leaves intact what the humans are trying to achieve? Or do you think there are some that, there's no way forward? What's the portfolio of transitions you'd in
Yeah.
your dream utopia you'd imagine for this better world?
I think that I tried in the book to be really cognizant of the pros of these events, of sort of the benefits that they bring. It didn't take a lot of effort. Like it is what I felt for real. Like I think when you're walking around and you're seeing how much fun people are having, or I talk to some of the organizers and you hear what the money that they raise is going to be used for, like they're good causes. Like it's a good thing, when you're raising money to bring meals to people at the holidays who might otherwise have one, or you're using money to raise funds for some new civic improvement that the town desperately needs. Like those are good causes. Like I'm not anti civic progress, right?
And
Like
even the softer stuff about just bringing a community together.
absolutely.
And yeah, it's difficult,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
So
Because you've got to hold these things in your head at the same time.
exactly. And so I think that the community good, the feeling like a community, I think like spending time as a family, seeing people that you haven't seen in a while, like all of that is so important. And I mean, I had festivals in my town growing up like that. Like we all, like that's just it's human nature to do that. And so I really, like I said, tried to be realistic about my response to these, because it's not as simple as saying, let's wipe them off the map. Like these festivals, almost all of the ones I went to are real identity bearers for these communities. It's things that like when you say you're from Punxsutawney, like everyone thinks about the groundhog. When you say you're from Sweetwater, like the roundup is the central event of the year. Like it's they become kind of bigger, more identity driven than just kind of a random thing that you could stop easily. And so I don't have perfect answers for a just transition. I think some of them are easy. The Rattlesnake Roundup, in my mind, feels like one of the easier ones to transition. In Georgia, they have rattlesnake roundups too, and that in that state, for different reasons, they've all transitioned now to be no-kill roundups. So they still hold the event. They still have some snakes that have been like rescued and now they're in captivity, and they sort of bring them out for educational purposes, and they let people, like, they're still engaging with the theme of snakes. They're still, they're still a carnival. They're still, doing all the other things. But they're not sort of killing snakes in the same kind of visceral way that they are in Sweetwater. So that transition is one that exists out there. But I think there's much harder questions, like the jumping frog contest, the jumping frog jubilee that takes place in Angels Camp, California, is one that I come to again and again. As I don't know what that transition looks like. You can't jump frogs without frogs. Like you can't, it is, you can talk about it. You can put on a play about it. You could, like, there's other things you could do, but it's not like there's an obvious way to do that without using real frogs, in my mind anyway. And so I guess what I would say about sort of like a opportunity or a model for transition is that it's going to have to come from the communities. Like these events only matter because the communities feel like they do. Many of them are just sort of put on year after year, like they become more important because they've been put on year after year. So like the camel races, it's just like it's important because now we've done it for 60 years, and same thing with Punxsutawney Phil. I mean, we've done it for 100 years, so we're going to keep doing it, even though we all know it's made up. We all know it's sort of like has the silliness about it. And so I feel like that indicates to me that those are decisions. It's a decision these communities make every single year to put that on in the exact same way that they've done it before. And those decisions aren't inevitable. Every single year they have a chance, we all have a chance to sort of evaluate our relationship with animals and say, what can we do differently this year? And I think ultimately it's just going to have to come from the people who are putting these on so that they can maintain the good, maintain the community vibes, the carnivals, the civic fundraising, all of that without the harm to animals. And I think that, transitions can be hard, and I don't pretend to have perfect answers. I think if there were perfect answers, people would be, I wouldn't be the first one to come across them. But, I do think it's about kind of encouraging people to think about it. And, festivals are only as important as the people who attend. They're only as successful as the attendees and the money raised and all of that. So there's also opportunities for people in communities to look around and say, wait a second, that's not actually the best way to celebrate our history. Let's, brainstorm a new way and take charge and lead something new out of it. Because I think that it's really the point of these festivals is so kind of community identity driven that for someone like me who's not from any of these communities, I don't know that I have a perfect answer, but I don't think that means that there isn't an answer. I think it just means people have to decide they want to find it.
That's great. Thank you. And I think one of the other really challenging examples is where the festival is tied into a local industry, because one of the benefits for the humans involved in these festivals is, at least for the day or the weekend, there is commercial activity, tourists come in, there's money, there's but where the festival, like the Maine lobster setup, is actually a symbol of a wider industry that is often quite central to the economic well-being of those communities, that ties you into the area of transitions that we're more used to thinking about in the animal industry, which is animal agriculture. How do we drive that? So I guess that would be one other example where you've got another layer of challenge there, where it's not really just about the festival. There's a deeper transition challenge there about is there a better path for those communities to find that isn't grounded in exploitation and harm? And again, not easy answers, but
absolutely.
So my final question for you really is, in this entire fascinating journey you've been on, and this exploration and this, I think, really distinctive lens on human psychology, one of the core problems you've zeroed in on is this idea of human exceptionalism and how we separate ourselves from the non-human animals that are involved in these festivals. And then that enables us to do various forms of exploitation and harm, from the more to the less egregious. So that human exceptionalism, that human separation is important. But I'm interested, as you went through those festivals, whether you thought there were also lessons for our intrahuman ethics as well. And that can link to ideas of dehumanization. It can link to ideas of hierarchy, to in-groups and out-groups. It can lead to unfounded assumptions and just ignoring out-group humans because they're not understood in a particular way. Or in the more extreme examples, it can actually lead into a glorification of violence and a sort of might makes right ethics, and the mindset of someone like an Andrew Tate, or someone who's openly proud of misogyny, sexism, homophobia, and yes, violence and brutality against non-human animals, almost as an indicator of status. So again, I don't want to ramble too much, but did your experience in these festivals give you some lessons about intrahuman ethics and risks and challenges there?
Yes, I think that many of these festivals have a real strong in-group, out-group dynamic. I think the two in the dominant section, the Rattlesnake Roundup and the Maine Lobster Festival especially, I think the narrative kind of when you're present at these events is very much protecting us against the outsiders. Anyone who would complain about these things don't get it. They're not from around here. They don't, they're, XYZ. It's just sort of, it's a clear us versus them dynamic. And I think that's true, I think in some extent in the other festivals too, although it's less obvious. I think one of the things that I believe when I think about why I care about animal issues, something I believe very strongly this ties back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, is that systems and the logic of oppression are all always intertwined and sort of resonate across boundaries. So, using animals in an exploitative way without really thinking about them as individuals or even as just like creatures who are worth some level of respect, just like the respect of not dying, right? Or the respect of not being tortured or whatever. I'm not saying they have to be equal citizens to us, but just some basic level of respect. That logic is really, I think, underlies a lot of social oppressions that we've had in intrahuman context. So racial oppression, other forms of oppression, sexual orientation oppression. Like I think that treating people as less than because of how they look or how they, vocalize or how they manifest on this kind of embodied as their embodiments on this planet, like the logic of treating someone differently or treating someone as if they don't matter because of that kind of superficial stuff, it's all the same. And I think people sometimes bristle when you relate animals to all of that, but to me, I think it's this idea that there's always someone or something you can look down on. And I think that's part of what's hard with these animal festivals is not that these people were evil, bad people. Like we said about you and me with veganism, 10 years ago or whatever, everyone I interacted with was very friendly. People were, happy to see that I was there. Mostly people answered my questions, people were nice. And even when I was just like observing people without talking to them, they looked like good people, right? Like they were like, out on a Saturday with their families. Like it wasn't like they had, evil laughs, maniacally cackling in the background about the harm they were doing. It wasn't like that at all. And so I think you really have to wrestle with the fact that these are good people who maybe haven't thought critically about animals or who, have other things going on. And so animals kind of, it just like falls to the bottom of the pile almost. Like it just isn't something that they've either been trained to think about or that they have the capacity to think about. And I think that so to me, the overarching lesson both of like human animal relationships and I think human human relationships is how much danger there is in ambivalence, how much sort of power you can give up when you say, it doesn't matter, it's just a frog, or what, like those sort of like dismissive lessons, I think are really harmful and they resonate with much bigger issues. So sure, like I say in the book, like I understand that the 15 groundhogs or whatever it is every year that suffer for Groundhog Day is not a number that makes any sense to get up in arms about. Like I'm a logical person. I understand. But when you translate that logic of human exceptionalism, of using animals as props, of doing whatever we want to animals in captivity just because we want to look at them, and you zoom out, like suddenly we have, massive systems of animal captivity. We have massive systems of animal agriculture, and it's all the same logic. So I think animal festivals, and it's not that I think they are, the most important animal topic necessarily, but I think they're an accessible one. And there's something we can all look at and say, what's really going on here? And then the important step is to then zoom out and say, how do these systems of oppression sort of exist in other parts of our society, intrahuman or interspecies? And I think they exist in both places. And starting to untangle that takes time and effort and interest and willingness. But I think it's so critical and honestly so hopeful. I've gotten asked a lot about whether I have hope at the end of all this research. And I think I do. I think seeing really, um, seeing communities really caring about each other and about their progress and about their histories and communities, like those are goods. And I think that is such a good instinct. And I think that there's real hope as we move forward to start adding animals into that equation. The instincts are all there. It's just who we choose to apply it to. And I think, expanding our scope of justice, expanding the creatures that we allow into that kind of inner circle of care, I think is the next step. And I think it's totally achievable.
Yeah, thank you. And it's not as if when you went to these festivals that most of the people there were openly sadistic or
No,
glorifying the violence or reveling in the pain they were causing or, exercising their will to power because they had the power and they could just do what they like to dominate others, right? That's not the ethos, right? There might be a few people there, but I think those people are rare, right, in
absolutely.
humanity in general. So as you said, it's more about this sort of unthinking ambivalence and just sort of going along with the social norms and not really working it through that actually causes much more of the harm than the explicit, brutality and sadism. And
Exactly.
that's frustrating, but it's like you say, it's also hopeful, right? Because I maybe have this naive stance that most human beings are decent people, right? They have the capacity for enormous good, right? So there's hope
Absolutely.
there.
And I think there is hope there. And I think that something that I thought was really interesting throughout all these festivals is watching how sometimes explicitly, but often implicitly, they were teaching kids about the stories, teaching kids about these animals, and I think raising the next generation on some of these fundamental kind of principles of human exploitation of animals or of human exceptionalism or whatever. And I think that, it's one of the reasons festivals seem to me to be kind of an exciting place to look, is changing those stories, even in what many might think of as random contexts, like, jumping frogs or Punxsutawney Phil or this rattlesnakes or whatever. Changing those stories in those contexts will reverberate. Like if we start saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be slaughtering snakes just because, that suddenly then you're like, well, why are we slaughtering lobsters just because? Well, why are we slaughtering cows just because? And you can sort of start the zoom out process. And so I think festivals are just like often they're like, because they're so random, they're a good place in some ways to start, because we don't have as many kind of preconceived notions or as many kind of personal, feelings about them from afar. The communities obviously do, but hopefully readers of my book might not. And I think then, the goal that I have through this book is to say, if you care about that and you care about that and you care about that, like, here's the next step. Let's start kind of zooming out at these festivals. And so I hope the book kind of ends in that place.
Yeah, it absolutely does. They can be really interesting sort of cultural leverage points we can pull on, and then the ripples can flow out and the stories and the narratives can flow out too. And just to tie back to your background as a lawyer, I like the way you describe law as stories made enforceable. So if we can change the stories and the narratives, then eventually we might have some, enforced laws that can protect
Exactly.
rights for sentient beings, not just for us humans too. So, well, that's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much. And it's a real privilege to read your book and then actually get the chance to, talk to you through it and explore your own journey and what it's taught you about humanity too. Is there anything else you wanted to add in before we finish? But also, most importantly, how can people buy the book, check out your Substack, follow you on social media if you do much of that?
Yes, I am so excited to get to connect with anyone who wants to. I'm available on social media. My handle on almost everything is MeLampy, so EMELAMPY. My book is called Forget the Camel: The Madcap World of Animal Festivals and What They Say About Being Human, and it's available anywhere books are sold. If you Google the title, it'll pop up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. You can also order it from your local bookstores or request it from your local library.
Wonderful. Well, I will include those links in the show notes too. But again, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure
Thank you.
exploring animal festivals with you and understanding your philosophy and your work too. So thank you. Please do
Likewise.
stay in touch, Elizabeth. Take care.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.